The Enemy, Class 12, Chapter 4, Vistas CBSE English Core. This lesson is explained in English. The writer is Pearl S. Buck.
This is part 4 of the explanation. It starts from page number 41. The links to the video lessons 1, 2, and 3 can be found in the description box. Let's begin. Sadao did not let any thoughts enter his mind as he went into the American's room. He was surprised to see the man out of his bed. He was getting ready to go out into the garden. Tom was happy. Tom is the name of the prisoner of war. He was happy and said that he felt good again, except that his muscles on the sides of his body were stiff and rigid. Sadao was surprised to hear that. He forgot everything else, what the general had said about the problems of getting rid of this person, and he just became the doctor once again. He said that except Sadao forgot everything else and said that he had warned the man not to stand and walk. He lifted his shirt and inspected the scar. He said that massage could heal it if it would not be healed by exercise. The man said that the scar would not trouble him. His young bearded face was weak. He thanked Sadao and said that if he had not reached him that day, he would have died. Tom was still weak and not recovered fully. And he said that if all Japanese people would have been like Sadao, there would be no war. Sadao said that maybe it could be true and that Tom should go to sleep. Sadao was restless all through the night. Why? Because he felt that the hired killers were there to kill the man. He imagined hearing the sound of footsteps, branches being broken, stones moving as men walked on them, and imagined that he heard such a noise, which indicated that some men were carrying the American's dead body. All this anxiety kept him awake. The next morning, he made the excuse to go first into the guest room to see if the American was gone. But when he opened the door, Sadao saw Tom sleeping peacefully. Hana asked Sadao what should they do with the man. Sadao shook his head and promised that he would decide it in 1 or 2 days. Sadao thought that perhaps the killers would come the next night. The night was windy. He heard the sounds made by the branches as they bent due to the wind, and the partitions made whistling sound as the wind passed through them. Hana woke and asked that they should close the partition of the man's room or not. Sadao refused and said that the man was capable of doing that himself. The next morning, the American was still there in the room. Sadao was hopeful that the assassins might come on the third night. Instead of the wind, there was rain that night. The garden was full of noises as the water dripped down the roof and tiny rivulets flowed through the garden. Sadao slept a little and jumped as he heard a loud noise. Hana heard the loud crash and asked what it was. The baby also woke up and started crying. Hana wanted to go and check on it, but Sadao stopped her. Hana screamed at him and asked what the matter was. Sadao spoke softly and asked her not to go. He was scared, and his scare affected Hana too. She stood without breathing and waited. There was silence, and both of them crawled back into the bed, with the baby lying on the bed in between them. In the morning, when Sadao went into the guest room and saw the man, he was still there. He was happy and had taken his bath and started moving around. He had borrowed a razor from Sadao the previous day and had shaved his beard. There was a faint color in his cheeks, means that he was recovering. The color of his cheeks was slightly pinkish. He was getting better. Sadao wrapped his traditional Japanese gown. He was tired because curiosity had kept him awake for 2 consecutive nights. He decided that he could not pass one more night in such a way. He was not bothered about the man's life, but he could not bear the stress and anxiety any longer. Sadao said to the man that he was well now. He lowered his voice and said that he was strong enough to sail a boat. Sadao planned that if he arranged a boat, stock it with food and extra clothing, the man would be able to row it to the nearby island. As the island was so close to the coast, it had not been guarded. It was not inhabited as it sunk into the sea during the storms. As it was not the season of storms at that time, the man could live on this island until he spotted a Korean fishing boat pass by. The Korean fishing boats passed near the island as the sea was very deep there. The young man stared at Sadao. He must understand the fact that the man was living at his house was known to everyone. The young man agreed with him and said okay. He moved his head to indicate his acceptance. Sadao left and did not meet the young man until evening. During the day, he made arrangements for him. As it became dark, Sadao pulled out a big boat to the shore. He placed food and bottled water in it that he had bought secretly during the day. Naturally, because he was sheltering a prisoner of war, he kept two quilts in it, and there was a high tide in the sea at that time, so he tied the boat to a pole. It was a dark, moonless night, and Sadao worked without a torch as he did not want to be spotted by anyone. When Sadao came home, he pretended as though he had returned from work so that Hana did not suspect anything. She served him the evening meal and said that Yumi had visited them that day as she missed the baby a lot. Sadao said that as soon as the American left, the servants would return. That night, before going to bed, Sadao visited the man. He checked his body temperature, the wound, and pulse. His heartbeat was unsteady due to excitement as he was about to leave their home. The man's lips were pressed together and his eyes were red in color, which seemed to be burning with fire. The scars on his neck were still red as they had not healed yet. The young man said to Sadao that he was saving his life once again. Sadao said that it was not like that. He was sending him because he could not keep him in his house any longer. Sadao was reluctant in giving him a torch as he felt that if the man used it unwisely, he could be spotted and would land into trouble. But on a second thought, he finally gave him his own torch, the one that he used when he had to attend to patients at night. Sadao instructed the man that if his stock of food finished before he found a Korean fishing boat, he could signal him with two flashes of the torch at dusk time. He asked him to be careful not to signal when it was dark because light was more visible in the dark as compared to dusk. He added that the man could find fish in the sea near the island, but he had to eat it raw. He must not cook it because fire would be spotted by the guards and that could put him in danger. The man wore the traditional Japanese dress that Sadao gave him to wear. Finally, Sadao wrapped a black cloth around his head to hide his golden hair. The American shook hands with Sadao and left. Sadao waited till the torchlight was flashed once more, and then he closed the door of the partition and slept well because his burden was relieved. A week ago, the general had been operated upon in an emergency. Sadao informed him that the man had escaped. The general was weak as he was recovering from the operation. For 12 hours after the operation, his condition was critical, and Sadao was not sure whether he would survive. They had operated upon his gall bladder. The general was an old man. After the operation, he started eating food and breathed deeply. Sadao did not have the courage to ask him what happened to the professional killers that he had promised to send to kill the American. At Sadao's home, things returned to normal. The servants returned. Yumi used sulfur to disinfect the room that the American had used. The servants did not speak anything. The gardener was annoyed because he had got late to plant the chrysanthemum flowers due to this incident. After 1 week, Sadao felt that the general was well enough and told him that the man had escaped. The general was reminded of his promise to send the professional killers, and he opened his eyes suddenly when he heard about that American. He was surprised and said that as he was suffering due to bad health, he had forgotten all about the promise. Sadao spoke softly and reminded the general that he had forgotten his promise. The general felt sorry and added that he loved Japan and was not shirking from his duty. He looked at Sadao with curiosity as he sought support from him. He wondered that Sadao understood his problem or not. Sadao stood in the veranda and recollected the past events. He looked at the sea from where the man had come that night. He had flashbacks of all the Americans he had met in his life, the dull professor at whose house he had met Hana, his silly, talkative wife who was very kind. He remembered his teacher of anatomy who had taught them to cut open the body with a knife. Then he remembered the fat landlady. Being a Japanese, he had found an accommodation in America with great difficulty. He hated living there knowing that the Japanese were superior to the Americans and were still being treated like inferiors. He hated living there knowing that the Japanese were superior to the Americans but were being treated like inferiors. Sadao disliked the dirty old woman who finally agreed to let him live in her home, which was in a bad condition. Sadao tried to be thankful to her, but it was difficult. He hated her so much that even her kindness could not make him like her. Finally, Sadao remembered the white and terrible face of the American prisoner. Sadao felt that it was strange that he could not kill his enemy. That was the end of the explanation of the lesson. If you still have any doubts, do send it in the comments box. I would be glad to answer your questions. The author has beautifully portrayed the conflict in the doctor's mind as an individual and as a citizen with a sense of national loyalty. It is his emotion of not frivolously wasting a human life that makes him take this decision. This is a story of true compassion that rises above petty differences, obscure biases, and incurable hatred. It is really very difficult to understand why Dr. Sadao saved an enemy, but it is his humanity that is the primary reason. The humanity of Dr. Sadao and Hana raise a lot of relevant questions about war, love, peace, suffering, loss, and humanity. It actually redefines the true enemy. Who is the true enemy? The true enemy is our hatred, prejudice, violence, and war. And this story redefines it by showing how love always conquers these negative emotions. It gives the message that humanism transcends all man made prejudices and barriers. Dr. Sadao upholds the ethics of the medical profession by treating an enemy. This story gives a great lesson of peace, love, sympathy, fellow feeling, and humanism. If you learned from this video lesson, do like, share, comment, and subscribe to my channel. Do press the bell icon and keep watching other videos. Watch out for part 3 and look for links in the description box.